The train screeched as it rolled into the small, wind-blown town of Dry Creek, the steam billowing upward in a dark cloud that hung in the bright western sky, and Clara Whitmore pressed her trembling hands against the carpetbag that carried all she owned in the world, her heart pounding with dread at every hiss of the engine, every creak of the wheels, every jostling movement that meant she was closer to meeting the man she had promised to marry without ever having seen his face, for back in St. Louis she had been left with little choice, her father having died suddenly the winter past, her mother long buried, her family home sold to cover debts that no one spoke of aloud, and with no brothers or kin to protect her or offer her a place. She had answered an advertisement written in bold black letters in a worn newspaper: rancher in Wyoming Territory seeks wife, must be strong, willing, and faithful, marriage guaranteed, steady life offered. At first she had stared at those words for hours, torn between fear and necessity, and when she finally put pen to paper and wrote to Daniel Hayes, she did so with the desperation of a woman who could no longer dream of romance but could only pray for survival, and his reply had been short, plain, and honest: "Come on the train to Dry Creek, I'll meet you there. If you are willing, we'll be married by the parson next day. I can promise steady work, a safe roof, and a place that will be yours as much as mine. D. Hayes." Clara had folded that letter again and again until the creases wore thin, reading it in the lamplight each night as the days drew nearer, yet she could not erase the voices of her aunts and neighbors who had warned her in whispers that frontier men were hard, rough-handed, that they treated women as little more than tools or beasts of burden, that a rancher's wife was bound to long days of toil, silence, and sometimes even the back of a man's hand when whiskey ran hot in his veins, and though Clara prayed it would not be so, her imagination filled with cruel images as the train slowed and the passengers rose around her, chattering in excitement to meet kin or friends, while she alone sat stiff, cold with worry, clutching her carpetbag as though it were a shield against the life rushing toward her. When at last she stepped down onto the wooden platform, the sun hit her face and she blinked beneath the brim of her simple bonnet, scanning the crowd, seeing families embracing, miners in soot-stained shirts laughing, drifters leaning lazy against posts, and for a moment she thought she had been abandoned, that perhaps the man who had written would not come, that perhaps she had traveled 5 days and 5 nights only to be stranded in this dry, dusty place with no way home, and her breath caught like a trapped bird until she saw him. He was taller than most, his shoulders broad beneath a plain but neat shirt, his hat pulled low to shade a face carved by sun and wind, and as he moved through the throng his stride was steady, his boots worn from honest labor, and Clara's stomach turned with both fear and strange relief, for though she had dreaded meeting him, she knew at once it must be Daniel Hayes, and when his eyes found hers she felt the air shift around her, as though he had known her already, as though this moment had been fixed long before. He tipped his hat politely as he came to stand before her, his voice low and carrying the slow drawl of a man used to wide spaces and few words. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked, and though his tone was soft, it carried a steadiness that made her pulse race. Clara nodded, barely trusting her voice, her grip tightening on the carpetbag until her knuckles whitened. "I'm Daniel Hayes," he said, and his gaze held hers without judgment, without that sharp measuring look she had braced herself to endure, and after a pause he added simply, almost quietly, "I'll be kind." Those words stunned her more than any blow could have, for she had prepared herself for commands, for a hard man's inspection, for some sign of coldness or cruelty, but kindness was the last thing she had expected, and her eyes flickered up to meet his in disbelief, searching for mockery, but finding only an earnestness that unsettled her in a different way, as if he understood her fear without her speaking it. For a moment she could not breathe, and then she lowered her gaze, whispering a thank you that barely passed her lips, and he offered his arm, shifting awkwardly as though unused to ceremony. "The wagon's just yonder," he said, motioning toward the street where horses stamped against the dust. "It's a fair ride out to the ranch, but I brought a flask of coffee if you'd care for some along the way." Clara hesitated, her hand hovering before she let it rest lightly on his arm, the warmth of him seeping through the sleeve, and as he guided her from the platform she felt her heart steady, though the fear still pressed against her ribs. The sun was high, the heat dry against her skin, the town bustling with men shouting, wheels clattering, children darting between wagons, and Clara clung to Daniel's arm as though it were the only steady thing in the chaos. He helped her into the wagon, lifting her carpetbag as though it weighed nothing, and once they were seated, he snapped the reins lightly, urging the horses into motion, their hooves clattering against the street until the town fell behind them, replaced by the endless stretch of prairie, gold and green rolling toward the far horizon where the sky curved down like an ocean of blue. Clara sat stiff, her hands folded tight in her lap, her mind still turning over those 3 words he had spoken, "I'll be kind." As though they were a puzzle, for they seemed too simple to be a promise and yet too heavy to be anything less than truth, and she found herself stealing glances at him, at the way his jaw set firm but not hard, at the lines at the corner of his eyes that spoke of sun and work rather than bitterness, and though silence stretched between them, it was not sharp, it was not the silence of danger, but something softer, like the pause between 2 verses of a hymn. At last Daniel spoke, his voice measured. "I know this can't have been easy for you," he said, eyes on the horizon, "coming all this way to marry a man you don't know. I don't reckon I'd trust that kind of bargain myself if I were you." Clara blinked, startled at his honesty, and for a moment she didn't know how to answer. "It was the only road left to me," she said finally, her voice tight but clear. "I prayed it would lead somewhere I could endure." Daniel nodded slowly, as though he understood more than she said. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he replied. "The ranch is hard work, the land harder still, but I can promise I'll not treat you cruel." Clara's throat tightened, and she turned her gaze out across the prairie, where a hawk wheeled in the sky, her heart aching with a fragile hope she dared not speak. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, the wagon wheels rattling over the uneven earth as the town shrank behind them and the wide sweep of land stretched in all directions, a lonely, breathtaking expanse of prairie where tall grass bent and whispered under the wind, and the silence between her and Daniel became a strange kind of company, not pressing, not harsh, but waiting, as though he would let her fill it in her own time, and she thought of all the warnings that had been given to her back in St. Louis, of the stories of men who drank too much, who shouted at their wives, who worked them until their hands bled, and she could not help but wonder if perhaps Daniel was different, or if his words of kindness were no more than a curtain soon to be pulled aside, yet each time she risked a glance at him, she saw no cruelty etched in his face, only a certain weariness, like a man who had carried more than his share of solitude and was not eager to add burdens to another. And as the hours passed, she dared to ask, quietly, "Have you lived here all your life?" Daniel flicked the reins gently, his gaze never leaving the trail, and answered, "Near enough. My folks came west when I was a boy. My father carved out the first posts of the ranch with his own hands. He and my ma both passed some years ago. Since then it's been me and the land, and the cattle, and a sky that doesn't let a man forget how small he is." Clara listened, surprised by the way his words carried a kind of reverence for the land, not bitterness, not complaint, but an acceptance that life was carved hard here and that a man must bend to it or break, and she felt a pang of recognition, for she too had bent under the weight of circumstance until she was forced westward. "Do you live alone?" she asked softly, and Daniel nodded once. "A couple of hired hands come and go during the season, but the house is mine. Too quiet, if you ask me. A man can only listen to the wind for so long before it starts talking back." His lips quirked at his own words, and though it was not quite a smile, it was enough to loosen the tightness in her chest. The horses pressed on, carrying them across miles of wild country, where patches of sage broke the monotony of grass and streams glinted like silver threads in the distance, and Clara felt the weight of the journey settle in her bones, but she dared not close her eyes, afraid that if she did she would open them to find herself in some harsher dream.